Hi, everyone. Thank you for continuing being with us. I'm Pablo León de la Barra, and I'm still the Guggenheim UBS MAP Latin America curator. The next session is artist-centered, so it's really about talking with artists and seeing a bit of their work, and really, through Sarah Raza's invitation, rethinking what ethnography in relationship to the arts means today. We're going to have two speakers, Ergin Çavuşoğlu, which I hope I pronounce well, and Javier Tellez. Each one will speak and present their work between 10 to 15 minutes. Ergin's biography, you have it on the paper, everyone, but I'll just give it a quick read. He's an artist who works in installation, painting, photography, sculpture, and video. He has had solo exhibitions at the John Hansard Gallery in Southampton, in England, Northern Gallery for Contemporary Art, Sunderland, Kunstberg in Freiburg, Germany, the Ludwig Forum, Aachen, Germany, Pier, London, and Jarat Contemporary Art Center in Baku, Azerbaijan. He has been included in numerous group exhibitions and represented Turkey at the Venice Biennale in 2003, was shortlisted for the Beck's Futures Prize in 2004, and in 2010 for Artes Mundi 4, one of the UK's largest art prizes. Çavuşoğlu lives and works in London, where he's currently Professor of Contemporary Art at Middlesex University. Ergin, we're happy to have you here, and we welcome you to the podium.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Pablo, for the introduction. Thank you, Sarah and the Guggenheim, for this wonderful opportunity. So central to my artworks are concepts that frequently explore ideas of place, space, liminality, mobility, and the conditions of cultural production, which I've been examining in classical, modern, and contemporary guises through painting, drawing, video and sound installations, and sculptures. In this short presentation, I will introduce the contextual framework of my practice and its broader capacity to examine socio-cultural terrains and human geographies. My works frequently engage with the in-between spaces of urban environments, airports, waterways, marketplaces, historical sites, and national borders. These are also places of mobility where ships, currencies, people, and time pass in this engagement with their geographical coordinates. Many of my early video pieces were filmed at night when spaces become liminal and redefined, creating a sense of demarcation. Under the current tendencies of cultural institutions to declassify, depolarize, and furthermore to kind of globalize artistic production, the artist as an ethnographer, which is the theme of this particular discussion here, today is a fitting position to be as someone observing and collecting data and artifacts from the surrounding human and geographical landscape. This is the instinctual response of the artist with the aim of utilizing what is at hand, visible, and tangible, and with an utmost urgency, as if reliving the Hugo Ball's Dada's perpetual state of rebellion and emergency. Artists nowadays inform their practices from a succession of sources that reflect reality in a kind of reciprocal awareness, but not necessarily always based on truth and continuum. The distinctive qualities and skills mastered by an ethnographer are not essentially at play in the artist's sphere of interest. The claims of ethnography are that a study is defined by its functional, empirical, and impartial way of observing reality and recording it, whilst examining culture and encountering objects of interest, the ethnographer analyzes their codes of signification and sometimes record their aesthetic values without bias, whereas objects of art are instilled with alternative subtext and associations. In the context of art, found and appropriated materials often become, as prescribed by Walter Benjamin, outmoded, out of place, and out of time. This detachment from reality relates to surrealism and its ability to stimulate change, not through theorization, but experimentations, as noted by Benjamin in his essay Surrealism, the Last Snapshot of European Intelligentsia from 1929. His enamored curiosity about the world, like an artist, allowed him to cross this threshold of knowing and provide more abstracted observation through mental and physical journeying, becoming what the anthropologist Michael Tasic calls master of non-mastery. Tasic commented recently that ethnography is fieldwork and can't be taught. How one does connect knowing with the unknowing, he asks. I would like to think that ethnographic turns in art are methods for disentanglement from previous modes of artistic production. Someone who understood clearly the relationship between art, surrealism, and ethnography is the anthropologist James Clifford. I'm just going to quote something very briefly here, where he talks about modern surrealism and ethnography began with reality in question, deeply in question. The surrealists were intensely interested in exotic worlds. Their attitude, while comparable to that of a field worker who strives to render the unfamiliar comprehensible, tended to work in the reverse sense, making the unfamiliar strange. The contrast is in fact generated by a continuous play of familiar and the strange, of which ethnography and surrealism are two elements. Following Duchamp, conceptual art in the 1960s also began with the reality in question and shifted the focus from the visual and material to the idea and the thinking processes, which in turn gave the premise for the rise of ethnographically driven practices of 1980s and 1990s in the West and later in what we termed here the Global South or the Southern Hemisphere. Over the past 2 decades, there have been some major changes in the ways contemporary art is produced and disseminated on the global stage. Examining the properties of contemporary art, Hal Foster, in his last book, said that it is too early to historicize this art, but perhaps not too early to theorize it. And this is a quotation from the Foster's Bad New Days, Art Criticism Emergency. Broadly speaking, what we are witnessing nowadays is the kind of arbitration between making and thinking. The thinking in this respect is a specialized act, something like knowledge visualization. Here, I'm very much in accord with Deleuze's views expressed in an interview from 1987 that, quote, to have an idea is not a general thing. Sometimes an idea in painting, in novel, in philosophy are evidently not the same thing. Furthermore, ideas should be treated as types of potentials that are already engaged in one or another mode of expression and are inseparable from that mode of expression. However, of course, it is also correct to say, I'm quoting here from Clifford, that in cultural life, no field of social or artistic research can long remain indifferent to influences or provocations from beyond its disciplinary boundaries. Of course, he made this comment in relation to surrealism. You know, he was looking at the period between the two wars, so I'm kind of recontextualizing that thought and relating it to art practices nowadays. Relating to these ideas of entwining the disciplines of human and social sciences, literature, and art, I would like to introduce briefly my most recent project, which evolved over a prolonged period of time and took several years to produce. It is a single-channel video piece, and I would call it installation, entitled Desire Lines, Tarot and Chess from 2016, with accompanying paintings and reliefs that were developed alongside the film and used as props during the production. I would also like to mention here about the more specific relationship between my practice and literature. I frequently work with non-fiction and fiction texts in the development of my projects in various forms and contexts. Sometimes I produce cinematographic and theatrical adaptations from these writings, and often texts institute concepts, or these ideas are seated within the main body of the script and act as forms of conceptual purifications. The Russian film director Andrei Tarkovsky, in his book Sculpting in Time, said that the scenario dies in the film. Cinema may take dialogue from literature, but that is all. It bears no essential relation to literature whatsoever. Similarly, the patterns of literary references in my works no longer function as storytelling devices, but allude to the kind of deconstruction of the narrative element of an image or object and comment on contemporary art at large. I'll just introduce the project very quickly for a couple of minutes, and then I will show you, and it's not an excerpt, it's a selection of slides from the actual video piece. Desire Lines, Tarot and Chess reveals the universal patterns of human behavior and their relationship to past, present, and future, observed through the prism of literary expressions articulated by Italo Calvino in his book, The Castle of Crossed Destinies from 1973. Calvino's book portrays an encounter of travelers who tell their adventures using tarot cards instead of words. The interpretations of the cards in the book allude to classic tales such as Faust, Oedipus, and Shakespearean narratives such as Hamlet, Macbeth, and King Lear. In Calvino's book, through the sequence of pictures, stories are told, which the written words tries to reconstruct and interpret. In Desire Lines, Tarot, and Chess, the stories are told by sequencing of images and fragmented speech. The characters, after losing their way in a forest and their ability to speak, all arrive at a castle. The castle keeper is the only person who can vocalize their stories. Each guest uncannily resembles a character in the classic Marset tarot set of cards. The sequence of the cards placed in one row composes one story, and laying over them another set, vertically or diagonally, constructs another one. The first story presents the tale of the knight who sets off for a shady meeting in the forest. He is ambushed and hanged by his feet. A passing stranger, the water-bearing maiden, saves him. He makes love to her, but the ungrateful knight hastily leaves the maiden and rushes off in pursuit of lost fortune. Instead, he loses himself in the forest before finally arriving at the castle. The second story is that of the alchemist. One day he is visited by the devil, who offers him the secret he has been longing for. Guards block entrance to the city of gold. The maiden and her 6-year-old son, from the fleeting encounter with the knight in the forest, challenge the guards to enter the city. At the knight's wedding reception, the boy appears carrying a sword. A struggle ensues that will leave the knight bleeding and possibly dead. The boy makes his way, he soon enters the castle, speechless, disoriented, searching to understand his own destiny as so many others have done before him. The mixture and contrast between history and contemporaneity in the storyline and the characters lend themselves to simultaneously present the narrative in a kind of linear fashion, as well as in a more abrupt way, thus interpreting scenes that happen across time and place in an absurd harmony. This is highlighted further by the universality of the themes explored in the film. I would like to show you a very short excerpt that will try to visualize what I just said. Unfortunately, we don't have time to show you the whole film, but maybe on another occasion we can do that.
Thank you, Ergin. Our next half of the couple of the afternoon is artist Javier Tellez. Javier uses film, video, and installation to question definitions of normality and pathology. He has participated in numerous group exhibitions around the world and has had solo exhibitions at the Power Plant in Toronto, Museo Galuste Gulbenkian in Lisbon, Museum of Contemporary Art Cleveland, SMAC in Ghent, San Francisco Art Institute, and Kunsthaus Zurich. He also participated in the PS1 International Studio Program in 1993 and the Whitney Independent Studio Program in 1997. In 1999, he received a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship. Javier Tellez lives and works in New York.
Thanks, Pablo. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Christina and the Guggenheim. I will be really quick so Pablo can catch his airplane, hopefully, for his next destination. When I received the invitation to be part of this panel called Ethnographic Tones, I saw what could be better than to show a piece that had to do with an LP. It basically is the latest film I made. I finished it this year. It's called To Have Done with the Judgment of God. The whole film is based on this LP that I got, which have the recordings of Antonin Artaud radio piece of 1947 of the same title. I will read a text that I wrote on this film, and I will show two clips. So that's a statement I usually use to present the film with, but I had to warn that since the film is based on Artaud, one of the favorite phrases of Artaud was to say that, writing is garbage, writing is pig shit, so you should not take too serious my text and should focus more on the film. It starts, To Have Done with the Judgment of God, 2016 is the second part of a trilogy of film installations that focus on Artaud's visit to Mexico in 1936. The first installation, entitled The Conquest of Mexico, was exhibited at Documenta 13 in Kassel in 2012, and it was inspired by Artaud's notes for a play of the same title that he proposed in the Theater of Cruelty prior to his travel to Mexico. Almost 8 years after Artaud's initial journey, we retraced the writer's route and filmed two of the rituals described in Artaud's book, the ritual of the Tutugui and the ritual of the Peyote, Hikui. To Have Done with the Judgment of God take his titles from Artaud's radio plays, as I said before, that he made in 1947 for the Radio Diffusion Française. But it was censored at the time due to his context, which was deemed obscene by the Radio Diffusion director. The original transcript includes many references to the Raramuri people and the rituals, the most important being a poem inspired by the ritual of Tutugui. Antonin Artaud, like André Breton, Malcolm Lowry, D.H. Lawrence, Sergei Eisenstein, and others, artists and writers who traveled to Mexico in the first half of the 20th century, visited Mexico in search of otherness within the indigenous culture there. Artaud's main objective was to find a sacred culture rich in rituals and myth, which might offer an answer to the crisis of European consciousness. This quest for direct experience of the sacred links to an imperative that he shared with his peers in the European avant-garde, that which James Clifford has called post-symbolist poetics of displacement. These new forms of primitivism clearly oppose the exoticism of the 19th century and propose an aesthetic of difference that often include anti-colonialist and anti-imperialist stances in their discourse. This approach opened a critical space that preceded a transformation within ethnographic practice, which was manifest much later with George Bartel and the College of Sociology and even Jean Rouch film practice. So I commissioned for this piece an Raramuri language versions of Artaud's entire radio play and collaborated with a local radio station to broadcast it across the Sierra Tarahumara, which is in the state of Chihuahua in North Mexico. The film documents the public reception of Artaud's broadcast. Meanwhile, it captures glimpses of the everyday life of the Raramuri people. Segments of footage depict the rocky landscape of the Sierra Madre, which Artaud described in great detail in his text, The Mountain and the Signs. Images of this fantastic or hallucinatory landscape throughout the film are accompanied by the sounds of glossolalia text and noises that come from our original radio play soundtrack, which I have in the LP that I mentioned at the beginning. To have done with the judgment of God addresses questions of our identity, language, otherness, and altered states of consciousness. I will show the two clips. You will see there's a black in the middle. So the first clip will show documents the transmission of the radio, and the second clip illustrates two very important rituals of the Ngaramuri cosmogony. One is the tutuguri, which is the ritual of sacrifice or potlatch, which is done for the benefit of the family and the community. And the second one is the rite of peyote, which is being rarely filmed or exhibited.
Al servicio de la comunidad.
Ahora empezamos con una usana y un minuto sin malpa, hippie cinema koi ora rabani. Hipko ahora te machiboa, horera y jirba, aplica llena nari. Igual pa, na bile ra italian ba aplica. Tubul hitirba, gemia man cauchirba ni, habla con bile poeta. Ni igual pa nara ichirba, ayena vera, y yen narwa ichimi, naro achirabani. Ichikabrati, kipuom chivo, hipkoba. Chamba, Rupi, Arto, Saque, Kene, Gale, Denisa, Ali, Pasua, Mema, Echico, Pachana, y Weamitu, Keche, Omere, Meretewa, Chachu, Ome, Kona, Simaria, Echupi, Peyuga, Repa, Awa, Aliachi.
Nali Cristo anelia mihu, echuma porte, corna pereame, honoruame, Erika petenali que rebogea, reteuca, honsa machinisa, curisi chihonsa, tikinisa, mapogona, honoruame, mayeri, uchuca tipakima, kiwer sibu, rikapi echi, retewi chopibu. Huejihuero niwa la na'i ari ochi. Opasika siro con anewa que nawasati.
Kitisi omeama, onoruame, wachinala.
Kike taboa eke saretu ke ira. Keka nirika inale.
Chigonza mukuka betérica oneachi. Vilena muti galea miniru repeya alila. Echikohu witaka hena I weami.
Betele narako sepka rubea igua igua. Naribe ayam eki sare hiti kakatipo. Ochia mini sare di ira kipiti iwiroma ochira. Nari wanapuma o aami. Teteusa sapacha iri o cochichi oke. We niruria I ochi chariweame. Hiti koeala nako u. Uitako ke rewali. Pechope genaro na ima. Teteuiko ke rewanari. Kaka. Uitako nari telepa. Alinati hiwelka tu. Uitaka ewaru luka sapaka. Echigo mapu alichopi niruri. Ochi awatamisi. Echigo na mapoke mesa kere. Natema semesati kakati. Oreche modo do edire. Esa tau dari. Do madera coco.
I think it's really interesting after seeing these two different bodies of work, but which share a same interest in re-questioning what the ethnographic turn could mean today, you know, and in moving forward from the critique that Hal Foster did 20 years ago on artists using ethnography as a way of working or not working with other. No? So maybe the question would be for both of you, what do you think one has changed in artists using ethnography in their practice today? And what would be the ethics today of someone incorporating it into its own work, like both of you are doing, each in a very different way?
Okay. I mean, from my point of view, obviously, the ethnographic turn hasn't quite changed. I think as I mentioned, it is an approach, it is a method of thinking and working with the other, or with kind of surrounding human and sort of geopolitical landscape. But what has changed is the way, I mean, in the context of this particular exhibition and the map project, is that we can probably see that it's a little bit more evident in art coming from peripheries, and it could be categorized as having some kind of influences and position itself within the ethnographic turn. I mean, of course, there have been many other turns happening, a lot to do with sort of indigenous art, what I termed at some point indigeneity turn. But these are kind of institutional concepts, and I don't think they should, or that they perhaps necessarily affect the way artists think about approaching these particular subjects.
Well, I mean, perhaps Hal Foster's texts have been slightly overrated, I would think, in the sense that I don't think it can really, offer anything beyond what James Clifford did in The Predicament of Culture, beyond just, of course, applying to a very local scene, which is the New York scene related to the October generation, etc., etc. So, I mean, I love this David Hammond's piece, which stamps on our foreign tribal art, and we should try to kind of reverse ethnography and do an ethnography of October. Mm-hmm. So start to study, this tribe with the particular terms, what kind of rituals, what kind of habitats they inhabit. So. But I mean, I think what for me is important is to understand a notion of, exchange of subjectivities, which is always kind of excluded on this discussion of ethnography, which makes possible, for instance, the amazing body of work of Jan Luch as a filmmaker, which has been very influential for me, and the idea that you can actually become the other, or could you actually have a meaningful exchange with the other, beyond these dynamics of power, which are not as fixed as we think they are, You can see, for instance, I mean, the use of hallucinogenic drugs. I mean, me and partially the crew were were part of the ritual of the peyote, so that immediately changed our positionality. It's not that, we become the other, but we were not anymore where we were before. We were not in Kansas anymore, just to quote Wilberforce.
Yeah, I mean, it's very important as I mentioned earlier, talking about where these ideas are seeded, whether they derive from ethnography or other fields of humanities and social sciences, but as long as they somehow belong to the institution of art, then that is fine. It's really, I think Hal Foster's critique really is more about the sort of the pseudo-ethnographic approaches on both sides, really, artists behaving as ethnographers and ethnographers behaving as artists and so on and so forth. So I think from that point of view, I think his critique is still very much valid. What has changed is really the broadness of practices, and I think we can elaborate on this in many terms, and sort of the multiculturalism, institutionalization of art, globalization, and so on and so forth. They're all part of the same. It's about permutation. What permutates a particular context, particular idea to become, to be seated within the domains of art.
Well, I mean, of course, it's a highly egocentric model. I mean, if you see the Return of Real, or you see, the artist ethnographer, you see that most of the artist he studies are American, and most of them are white. So, I mean, with exceptions like Fred Wilson, Lena Green, etc. So, I mean, I wonder how could we actually apply this model of the artist as ethnographer if we consider practices that even went before, like Juan Downey, for instance, or Elio Tisica's encounter with the favela, what this will bring to the discussion, what is excluded from the discussion. So we want to think what is behind the exclusions of these models from this critique,
I guess there's something else that at least this work of yours brings into discussion. It's a film that I co-commissioned together with Javier's gallery, Clinton and Koning, and was shown here in New York in your exhibition, but also inside Santa Fe Biennial in New Mexico. And New Mexico is a highly contested territory in terms that it was an indigenous territory. It still is. And it's a place where many of the native indigenous cultures are very protective about their own rituals, about their own objects, which in many cases they have legally gone to the limit of not showing objects or not allowing objects to be shown in museums, to not allow rituals to be filmed, or even reclaiming or getting back the rights for those images not to be shown. I mean, one of the cases specifically was Avi Warburg's trip in the late 1819 something to Hopi territory in New Mexico, no? where he describes some of the rituals he witnessed, and which is still something highly contested today in that particular territory. On the other hand, Javier goes south of this border that exists now, which separates these different indigenous groups, with the Raramuri also, and you go there and you use Arto as a way of getting in and having access to these different rituals, and use peyote as a way of not being an outsider, no, of entering this kind of in between territory, no. So I guess I mean all this question of otherness, I mean, comes back to the very basis of the MAP project, where originally we as curators were asked to present the other cultures or our cultures to a kind of New York audiences. But then new questions arise from your practices and projects like this, no? Which continue to question this kind of in-between space or this space where there's still some other possibilities allowed to happen, no? Other kind of exchange. I don't know if you have anything else to say. If somebody from the audience has a question or a comment, I knew Carla Stelweg over there had something to say, and somebody else.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. My name is Fan. I'm a PhD student in Spanish and Portuguese at NYU. So I'm really interested in the Global South, multiculturalism, because I compare and research the intersections of Asia and Latin America. So one thing I'm actually curious about is the name, the Global South. And I wanted to hear actually both sections, the previous section, multiculturalism, and then the one in ethnography, before asking this, but I think in my experience, the Global South has been, like, what it evokes for me is trying to bring in more voices from maybe regions or traditions with not as much representation. But then the ironic thing is Global South, like the name South, it's opposed to a North. And I think what's interesting about art and art, film, and museums is that the space isn't necessarily limited to a text. So there's like non-verbal ways to express the ideas, which maybe opens up more of a space to get away from like how do we talk about places and traditions without as much representation, without always having to refer back to a framework of like we talk about the South as opposed to the North, or like the East as opposed to the West. So I was wondering, is that something that was part of the discussion when creating this program and the name of this program? And how your thoughts on how like the museum addresses that, especially the mapping project.
We discussed a bit of that yesterday. I don't know if you were here. I think Sarah Rasa naming the symposium decoupling really has to do with this kind of trying to avoid this kind of north, south, east, west antagonisms, and trying to find these other spaces, I would say, of action, no? These other territories that open beyond borders, which specifically in the times we're living now become much more important. I mean, there's a need, of course, and we talked also about it yesterday, to rethink what the global South meant and what it means today. Again, that the term is being reused because really I think we're in a kind of post-global South moment. No, I mean at the times it was used as a way of the non-aligned countries to develop frameworks of exchange, be it commercial, be it technologically, be it culturally. There were also, I mean, different historical exhibitions from Havana Biennale to different Pan-American, Pan-African, Pan-Middle Eastern exchanges and connections. Again, yes, on one hand, I mean, it becomes necessary to re-review this. And I think both of the topics that Sarah brought, and maybe she'll want to talk more about it, brought to this symposium today. One, rethinking what multiculturalism means and what speaking of the other and being the other means really help expand these territories and or help create what I call these in-between spaces where hopefully we can find more ways of negotiating and creating other spaces of action. So I don't know if you guys want to say something else. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Javier, Ergin. Thank you all for the patience.